Hello everyone and welcome to this episode of Art Talks, a series of conversations with artists, curators, collectors and writers. Today I'm very pleased to have Sandeep Mukherjee with us all the way from Los Angeles, California, on the occasion of his third solo with us at Project 88. Welcome Sandeep.
Thank you very much. I'm so excited to be here.
Okay, so let's dive straight in. And I have my first question to you is about the title of the show, Approaching Limits. When I think of the title, I get the sense of nearing a destination or a limit, but never quite reaching it. So there is this sense of perpetual motion. But at the same time, the limit stays in sight. It never really disappears. So there is this kind of tension. Can you tell us something about the title?
So I think this title has been in process for 20 years. I think it finally came to me in words as I started to understand my own process better. Motion or movement is very fundamental to my practice and has been. For me, space and time are created because of motion. Motion doesn't happen in space and time, but actually produces it. The other aspect of my process is rendering the invisible. So the limit of what one can see, what one can think, what one can feel, what one can sense has always been a driving force for my work. So the idea of movement and the idea of moving towards a limit of human capacity or even post-human capacity has been kind of a driving force. So fortuitously or not, the title came to be. I think I'm really pleased with this title because it somehow ties a lot of different bodies of work in the show together.
So let's look at the first work and let's walk towards it. So let's talk about the first work, Sandeep, in the show, which is actually a 5-panel work. Each panel or painting is on a material called duraline, which is a plastic polymer, which I think you've been using for a while now.
Yes.
As the title of the painting suggests, Parallax, there are always two vantage points and there is this sort of a edgy liminal space that is kind of created. And as you try to approach the work, yet you never can quite really approach it. There is this tension, this sense of unease.
Yes.
So what were you thinking? And I also just want to add that I know this work took you very long to do. Yes. I mean, you started this in 2015. And it's in this avatar here in 2023.
So I'm thinking about it at two vantage points, two lines of vision that are looking at the same thing, but that appear very differently. And so in terms of my process, I started this work as a very intimate relationship between the skin of the duraline and my body. So they were basically indexing my body as I was moving brushes, brooms, on the surface, literally like, writhing on the surface in some kind of a motion. So it was a way to capture the movement of the body, but as a result, also capture the residue of that movement through texture and color. So that was a very, very intimate relationship with the surface. And then as I continued to layer it and layer it and layer it, the skin started to build up. And then my impulse was to then move myself away from the image and sort of create a second point of view or a second way of making the work, but also looking at the work. So the orbs, there is no connection or contact between my body and the blue space. The paint falls from a spray bottle like rain onto the surface of the skin that I have been intimately in touch with, and creates its own space. So again, not only is the viewer, I'm hoping, has different experiences, but the image comes out of two very different processes and relationships to the image, to the object. So the 5 years that I've been working on it, I've been struggling with what it means that my body, what does it mean for my body to be in relationship with another skin, a second skin? And what happens when that contact separates and moves away and has a different relationship to the same skin? So you literally see yourself from another point of view. And so that's how this came to be. Also the density of the marks and the movements became so claustrophobic in a way. I wanted to punctuate them with like an opening or a door or a portal or a well. I don't have a word for it, but it is a space that from a certain distance looks like an object, but as you approach the work, it just becomes open space. So you have the possibility of the constrained object, but you also have the possibility of walking up and entering an open space, blue.
So that's what the orbs are doing. It's like a kind of a open space, but at the same time, it's kind of being framed by these forests around it.
Exactly. So that the idea that our experience is always framed by the limits of our bodies and of our capacities, but then if we can push our capacities to certain extents, we can start to see things that we haven't seen before.
Also, when we move back, there is this kind of bouncy movement, which I really love.
Yes.
Was that also intentional? Did you see it like a body like that?
No, it came to me after the work was actually further along, where I wanted those objects to move within the frame of the painting, just as I wanted the viewers to move up and away from the painting. So there were all kinds of motions that I was trying to articulate and create, and that was one additional movement that I added to this piece.
Yeah, so there is a kind of being sucked in, there's being thrown out, and then there's all this swirling motion.
Yes, and part of the geometries of the background, if you want to call it that, it kind of plays within the background foreground. There are all these sort of gestures of trying to reach, trying to contain, trying to hold something that ultimately is unholdable, ungraspable. So for me, the gesture of the body was kind of that idea that you're always trying to capture something that is ultimately elusive.
Sandeep, let's talk about this work, which is a large-scale work titled Tree Skin. As the title suggests, there's definitely an ecological register. So could you say something about that?
Yes, this work was actually motivated by the only oak tree that remained standing outside my studio after the rest of them were cut to make way for a development. And this tree became some sort of almost like a symbol, an icon for me as the only standing figure in that ground. I used to park my car under the tree. We used to sit under the tree. It provided beautiful shade. So it kind of had I had a really nurturing relationship to it. And then on the other side, I saw the violence that is perpetrated in terms of cutting and removing the trees. So that's where it started. This piece has a relationship to the piece that we saw earlier, where the making has a very intimate relationship to the surface on which it is made. So these are made by physical encounters between me and the tree with a sheet of aluminum in between. So that creates the second skin of the encounter that's happening between me and the tree. So we basically press into the tree, we keep rubbing and pressing and pressing and rubbing until a certain image emerges from that encounter. And that's how these trees skins, I think of them as skins because they just peel off the tree like a skin does. And they're sort of a second skin of that encounter between me and the last remaining oak tree. So one of the things that came about during the installation process was the relationship between the backside of tree skins and the Parallax works. So there was a really interesting relationship that happened as you walked past the distressed flesh and you had a sighting of this bright moon, blue moon rising almost from a landscape. So that kind of paradox, contradiction, complementarity, however you want to term it, was kind of exciting to see in the space. And you see it as you move through the space, and that vision keeps changing as you move through. It's almost like the moon rises and you see the entire moon.
I thought we could end by talking about your approach to abstraction. When we look at these largely geometric shapes, there's a sort of contradiction that comes into it, where you have the restraint of these precise, hard-edge, abstract forms, whereas when you look closer at each painting, there's an excess in those precise borders. The texture is layered over the years, and you can see that it almost like comes off the frame. So can you tell us a little bit more about your approach to abstraction and how you take these seemingly opposite limits and put them together?
So I think a lot of these works have a relationship to landscape, to textile, and to the geometries that we think about when we think about space and time. Perspectival geometries and circular spiraling geometries. So they all kind of come together in this one place. For me, abstraction is about movement. It's about moving from one place to another place or another point of view where you see something you hadn't seen before. So it's not a style, it's not a look, it's not an aesthetic, but it's an action of moving from one place to another to see something fresh and new. So yes, these are fractured, and within the components of the fracture, there's a lot of texture and movement. But then the geometry of the fracture is really rigid and constrained. So again, there's a certain amount of movement and freedom within the constraints that have been sort of composed on the pictures. So you'll see in a lot of them, there are perspectival lines that move across the picture plane, and they are in conjunction with circular and spiraling patterns, and the two are in conversation with each other. And that's kind of what I was trying to do, but I was also trying to open up the notion of landscape, not just in terms of a human standing in front of a horizon and understanding his or her position, but about being lost and not really knowing where one is and not understanding what the scale of it is. So for me, the loss of grounding and the loss of one's own scale becomes a very beautiful place to see something anew.
With abstraction also, often it's considered as a language to transcend reality or our perception, but your approach seems to take a different, you're using it within the idea of a limit. When you mentioned the idea of being free within these constraints and how that plays out. Also, I do have one question about the use of sand in these textures,
Yes.
and some of them are aluminium.
Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit about your process and how that comes in?
So the movement that occurs during the making of these paintings is the paint is sprayed from above and falls down on the surface, much like rain or mist. And depending on the quality of the surface, the paint moves across the surface. It's affected by evaporation, surface tension, the temperature of the space, the environment, the curvature of the floor. So basically, it registers all these things that you don't necessarily see or sense, but they somehow become registered in the painting. So there is that aspect of the rain or the paint falling on a surface that is non-porous, that does not absorb. And then the parts of the painting where the sand has been applied, the rain falls and gets absorbed and moves in a very different way, much like it does on Earth. So it was another way of creating a movement on the surface of the paintings that created a much different kind of dynamic, different texture, and had a different atmosphere to it.
Lastly, when we look at these forms, it's like entering a science fiction universe. You think about ideas of futurism and utopia, but they don't seem to be adequate to describe these works. It's like you take that as a point of departure and use it in your own language. So how does time and imaginations of utopic thought fit into these works?
So like I said, because of the two kinds of geometries that I'm trying to use, time is neither linear, nor is it necessarily only elliptical or circular. It's kind of in between the two, depending on where we are, where we stand, how we experience it. So for me, it's neither utopic nor dystopic. It's just an experience, a vision, a sight that you come upon. Again, it's not trying to take you to some happy place or a sad place necessarily, because they're all commingled in one. And so I think that's kind of the limit of our human experience, where it's along a spectrum. And it's not always just black and white, this or the other. It's always moving across the spectrum, which is why a lot of the color gradations in the paintings also move across the spectrum. So they start with a blue, end up with a green, or they start with an orange and end up with a really light purple. So there's continuous movement across the surface in terms of color and texture as well. So I think that's another way to create movement and space. And the quality of light and color actually give us the sense of depth in our real lives. So it was an attempt to sort of create that sort of experience for me.
We'd like to conclude by asking you about this painting, which is titled Past, Present, and Futures. Just if you could take us through the kind of dynamic movement that's happening, and even with the language, your eyes go into the line of the horizon, and then there's a limit that's pushing you backwards. Again, that oscillation, that contradiction that's going on throughout the exhibition seems, I think it would be great to end with looking at this work.
Yes, it's also the only work that has a visible horizon line that follows within a tradition of landscape painting, positions the viewer in a very particular place. But what I realize is that the meeting point, which is the horizon, never meets. It's endless, right? You keep moving through space, and it's just space. And you see a horizon further on, and further on, and further on. So it's this idea of deferred motion, never arriving anywhere. So that was kind of where I started thinking about this. This was also one of the last pieces that came out of a series of works I did called Horizons, that all sort of explored that idea where there was a definite joining or a line that connected two spaces, but there really wasn't. It was just what you saw. It wasn't the reality of the experience. So I coated the bottom section of the painting with sand. And so when I sprayed the color here, it got absorbed in a certain way. As you can see, the colors also have a gradation. So again, it was the idea of moving across each patch, so that there was a movement that sort of gave you a sense of depth, time. And the top is all aluminum, so when you spray the paint moves across the aluminum and registers every nuance, every curvature that you cannot see. So it picks up even slight indentations on the floor, on the canvas, slight indentations on the surface of the aluminum that are completely invisible to us. So it becomes, again, a way that you see things that you hadn't seen necessarily. When you look at something flat, you think of a space as flat. It's never really flat. It's got so much curvature in it. So I was sort of trying to sort of bring that to the fore. So all of these textures are basically recordings of curvature. And that's kind of what was exciting to me about the dynamics of this painting.
Thank you, Sandeep, for joining us today and for giving us a walkthrough of your incredible show at our space. And to everybody joining us online, stay tuned for more art talks, and thank you.
Thank you for having me here. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to show this work. As the title says, past, present, future, they all coexist simultaneously. And you see that in this exhibition where so many times, durations, and spaces have all come together.